This is a course about the Great Depression. I'm a child of that depression. I was conceived before the Great Crash, but I was born 5 months after it. As a child, I often wondered why I had no siblings. Soon into adulthood, I realized why. Fear. Fear that there might not be enough money. My parents were terrified they were not alone. I soon became conscious of the fact that many of my little friends and classmates also had few, if any, younger siblings. We had a very small class. In fact, I graduated in a mid-year class of only 12, and I went to a public school. So I decided to cobble together a storied history of the Depression to explore this formative period of my youth in depth. Here then is a brief outline of what we'll be doing. Today we'll take a look back at the period of the 20s and the story of the Great Crash, the invidious, tantalizing way in which the market coaxed investors back into their financial doom, like the infamous Lorelei or the sirens of Greek mythology. And we'll tell the story of an ominous dawn shape-up at the Ford Motor parking lot early in 1929, an unheeded warning sign of things to come. Next week, a besieged Hoover tries to cope. Our stories will lead us to a devastating riot at River Rouge and to a cultural phenomenon which developed along the rails of our country, a society in boxcars, sidings, which became the stuff of legends. Finally, next week, the story of the Bonus Army, a forlorn march on Washington which spelled the doom of the Hoover administration. Then on to the age of Roosevelt, the first 100 days, an explosion of acronyms, a lifting of the nation's spirits, a short-lived sigh of relief, and stories of how it looked from both the top and the bottom. Following this, we'll take an in-depth look at FDR, this fascinating, intensely paradoxical leader who dominated not only our political scene, but the entire cultural and economic life of our country for 12 of our most formative years in the 20th century. We'll explore his many faces, try to find out just who he was, where he came from, what stories lay behind the development of this unique personality. Then a look at the age of anxiety, the year 1938, time All Hallows Eve. The happening, a war of the worlds, and why that war was a metaphor for the nation's pulse, as storm clouds gathered in Europe and Asia, and the domestic economy spiraled downward once again. Finally, to Churchill and Roosevelt, the story of the fascination of both of these two leaders with secret intelligence, and their clandestine alliance, which may well have saved Western civilization as the Great Depression came to an end in the bittersweet reality of the Second World War. Why a storied history? Well, I decided on reflection that what is history after all, if it is not simply selective stories of people? And telling stories of people is much more fun and a lot quirkier than a recitation of dates and dry statistics. It's also more revealing. Besides, regarding statistics, you may recall that Benjamin Disraeli once pointed out there are three kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. But allow me a disclaimer right at the outset. A few of the stories, certainly not most of them, are my stories. They're a reflection of my perspective as a child, what I saw, what I heard, what I experienced subliminally often, because I was a child. And I realize only now in retrospect what it was that I was experiencing. I have tried to place these few personal experiences in the crucible of history. The history of the time as I now know it. Most of the stories, of course, of leadership, Hoover, Roosevelt, Churchill, and prominent figures such as Ford, Lindbergh, and Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, some were very well known. and of those they led, or in some cases led astray. Why the Great Depression? Well, surely many of my values were shaped during this period. As I considered the period in great depth, however, I realized that many of our country's core values were sorely tested during this treacherous time. It was a time when we as a nation were forced to re-examine our self-image and to reassess many of the ideals and values built by the likes of Mason, Adams, and Jefferson into our Declaration of Independence, and by Madison and Hamilton into our Constitution. What George Mason saw in our people in 1776, what Alexis de Tocqueville saw in our people in 1831, a rugged individualism, a self-reliance that had built our country, that had enabled us to break free from England and eventually to conquer the wilderness and forge the West, all this was now placed in the crucible of the Great Depression. It was sorely tested, as was our commitment to democracy itself. It was perhaps the most severe test in our history. We emerged, but severely chastened. How did it happen? Here's the story. The not-so-roaring 20s. It's always seemed to me that the 1920s was sandwiched. It was an era which began with the end of a great catastrophe, the New Deal, World War I, and ended with the beginning of another great catastrophe, the Great Depression. The period in between was characterized by tectonic, cultural, and economic shifts. And the dramatic interplay between the two, the culture and the economy, becomes more evident as one studies the era. H.L. Mencken once quipped, "Immorality is the morality of those who are having a better time." When we think of the 20s, we tend to think of immorality, of those who were having a better time. We conjure up impressions of flappers and the Charleston, Stutz Bearcats and Model A Fords, rumble seats, bathtub gin, stunt flyers and flagpole sitters, movie madness, Charlie Chaplin, Max Sennett, Harold Lloyd, Fatty Arbuckle, and Betty Boop and Mickey Mouse were born. We think of great cultural strides in music by uniquely American composers. We think of the Jazz Age and of musical masterpieces such as George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. We think of the decade as it started with high spirits, high hopes, high ideals. The Great War was the war to end all wars, and the League of Nations, even though we didn't join, would nevertheless usher in an era of peace between nations. There was no end in sight to progress. Science was making spectacular strides. In medicine, insulin was discovered. For the first time in history, diabetes could now be controlled. In 1921, Einstein, already a Nobel laureate, discovered relativity, which revolutionized scientific thought. Immunization was introduced against diphtheria and smallpox, both of which had raged unchecked as the decade started. It was an era of stark contrasts. Political leaders were perhaps the most conservative in the 20th century. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover all fit this description. But if it was an age of political conservatism, it was also an age of moral latitude. Flappers set out to flout convention, like Carol Kennicott, the heroine of Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, who tried unsuccessfully to breathe life into the vapid Midwestern town of Gopher Prairie. They embraced high-kicking, flamboyant dances such as the Charleston, and they reveled in wild parties. Prior to the decade, even women's ankles were partly hidden. Now, women's skirts were fashionably raised to the knee, necklines plunged, hair was cut short. Men began to wear wide, floppy trousers. Of course, I guess we've come back full circle since the 20s. Although it was an era of great prosperity, it was also an era of grinding poverty. And regrettably, there was a far darker side to the 20s. Our first story, then, takes place in the eerie pre-dawn hours of January 2, 1929. The setting is a car park just outside the River Rouge plant of the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. Let me paraphrase the scene as described by T.H. Watkins in the riveting beginning to his book, The Hungry Years. The sky was overcast. The pre-dawn night was black. It was 14 below zero. There was snow and slush on the ground as men had begun to gather in a car park. Their presence was made sinister by the glow from the interior factory lights that filtered through the blue-tinted windows, and from the pulsing foundry and blast furnaces of the large industrial complex, the largest in the world. The sheer size of the plant was mind-boggling. It contained 90 buildings, 2 of which alone exceeded in length the equivalent of 5 football fields. There were 27 miles of conveyors, 93 miles of track. River Rouge had its own deep-water port, and ships from the Great Lakes were constantly moving in and out, bringing in iron ore and steel. The complex employed over 40,000 workers. It took 5,000 of them just to clean it up. Why then were men gathered in a parking lot in the freezing pre-dawn hours? After all, the 20s economy was booming. Flappers were flapping. Gatsby's God was in his heaven. Or was he? Just 2 weeks earlier, the Ford Motor Company had broadcast an invitation for prospective employees. The 32,000 who stood huddled and shivering in the snow and slush had come from as far away as the Mississippi Delta, the Rio Grande, Pittsburgh, and Tennessee. All they wanted was a job. What they got was a human lottery. Hiring agents took in the first 10, then arbitrarily turned away the next 10. As this process continued for hour after hour, the men grew restless and began jostling for position. Then, suddenly, without warning, the guards turned fire hoses on them. In the freezing cold, icicles quickly formed on some of the men. A number collapsed. Exhaustion, exposure, hypothermia. Others remained where they stood. Some of these stalwarts were rewarded. They became part of the 30,000 new employees hired by Ford to expand his workforce to 150,000. The demand was huge and seemed never-ending. Henry Ford had wrought an economic miracle. No doubt about that. As Watkins points out, Henry Ford had played a central role in the flowering of this new age of consumerism. His Model T Ford was sturdy, reliable, quirky, and much loved. From its first appearance in 1908 until Ford shut down for 6 months to retool the Model A in 1927, the Model T was in the minds of many the most purely democratic machine in history. Ford had sold 15 million of them. They were modestly priced so that they were within the financial grasp of salesmen, clerks, farmers, blue-collar workers, even of the workers that made them. In 1927, Ford had been voted the greatest man in history after Jesus Christ and Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the living symbol of power, of American individualism, self-reliance, of the American faith in the ability of every man to earn for himself. He was every boy's idol, Horatio Alger, a shy, rather awkward farm boy with rural homespun values, a dedicated tinkerer and a maverick who had risen to become a titan of industry. In 1914, Ford had revolutionized mass production. He had raised his workers' pay to $5 a day, twice what they'd been getting from him and twice what they could get from other auto workers. Ford had struck a simple American bargain: security for hard work, and it had paid off. Ford created a new colossus, Detroit. The home of his River Rouge plant was now a thriving metropolis with the River Rouge plant as its base. To be a Ford worker was to wear a badge of distinction. And the workers who wore those badges were turning out 6,000 Fords a day. At one point, production actually reached 9,475 cars a day. Although Chevy, Plymouth, and Packard in this country and Mercedes in Germany were also producing passenger cars, half the cars in the world were Fords. Henry Ford had lowered the price so you could buy a Ford for the price of a team of horses. At one time, the dream that a farmer could own an automobile was beyond the wildest imagination. Now a car was within virtually every farmer's grasp. Ours was a land of limitless opportunity, and it was coming of age. There were massive socioeconomic changes wrought by the Ford phenomenon. Many in this country had lived their entire lives within a 50-mile radius of home. Now suddenly, new worlds opened up to them, with vast cultural as well as economic consequences for our country. Between 1919 and 1929, the number of motor cars in the United States increased from 7 million to 23 million. The development of mass production pioneered by Ford, coupled with the mass marketing of automobiles and the introduction of installment buying, created an insatiable demand for highways, bridges, related infrastructure. More cars on the road meant more steel mills, more rubber and glass factories, more collateral and support jobs in such places as Toledo, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Akron, Detroit. All of this Ford had played a major role in bringing about. So as Henry Ford entered the plant on that bitter, cold morning of January 2, 1929, the sight of 32,000 workers lined up in the slush and snow undoubtedly gave him considerable satisfaction. They were living proof of the magic he had given his nation. Ford, who considered himself a religious man, had once proclaimed machinery is the new Messiah. And in many respects, he echoed the sentiments of the time. President Coolidge himself had proclaimed that business is one of the great contributing factors to the moral and spiritual advancement of the race. And business was indeed our morality. It was our holy grail. The America Coolidge presided over during the so-called era of prosperity was a fount of technological genius and business acumen, and it was focused upon pursuit of that grail. American industry, enhanced by the war, had given us material prosperity in the post-war era, unlike any the world had ever known. When Herbert Hoover had been inaugurated in March 1929 on a Bible open to the Sermon on the Mount, his acceptance speech enunciated a karma which seemed in perfect harmony with that of Henry Ford and the sentiments of the times. Ours is a land rich in resources, proclaimed Hoover, stimulating in its glorious beauty, filled with millions of happy homes, blessed with comfort and opportunity. In no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure. In no nation is the government more worthy of respect. No country is more loved by its people. I have an abiding faith in their capacity, integrity, and high purpose. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope. Yet fewer than 60 days before that glowing inaugural, if Henry Ford, gloating on that cold, sub-zero morning in Dearborn over what his genius had wrought, if that same Henry Ford had been a reflective man, he might have begun to wonder, if this country is doing so well, why is it that 32,000 men need work so badly that they are willing to travel thousands of miles by whatever means they can, and to suffer misery and the risk of death in order to find it? Something was awry, but what and why? No one has yet arrived at a definitive answer, at least not to my satisfaction. But a good start, in my judgment, is the analogy to a virus that gives rise to a cold. It's an analogy devised by Robert McIlvaine in his book, The Great Depression, and a theme elaborated on by T.H. Watkins in his book of the same name. McIlvaine pointed out that when someone becomes ill after catching a chill, it's not the cold itself that causes the sickness. Rather, the cold reduces the body's resistance to microorganisms already present, which are then able to cause the illness. So let's take a look at some of the microorganisms that may have contributed to what we now know was certainly the greatest and most prolonged economic disaster in our history. Then we'll take a look at the riveting story of the crash itself. These microorganisms are by no means the definitive cause of the crash, but taken together, they certainly cannot be ignored as significant factors helping to grease our slide into the abyss of the Great Depression. Microorganism number one, international weakness. America emerged stronger than ever before from the First World War. Its natural trading partners in Europe, both victors and vanquished, were crushed. Prior to World War I, Great Britain was the world's banker and resultantly the world's largest creditor. After the war, the British economy was shattered, and America assumed this banker-creditor role. America had lent over $11 billion to the Allies during the war. Following the war, America invested another $15 billion more in Europe in the form of loans. How was Europe to repay them? Well, Versailles was supposed to take care of that. Germany was scheduled to pay reparations to France, England, and Belgium, who in turn would repay the United States. The loans would stimulate European economies, which would then in turn enable them to buy American goods. It was supposed to be a neat economic cycle. Problem was, just didn't work. Why not? Well, for one thing, as the U.S. stock market boomed in the 20s, U.S. banks and other domestic lenders increasingly found it more profitable and easier to lend into the margin bubble here in the United States. Why lend abroad? After all, here they had domestic securities as collateral and local borrowers to look to for repayment. Much easier. Moreover, interest rates were high. Nobody seemed to care, least of all the borrowers. As the market continued its dizzying rise, both the investors and their bankers were making money hand over fist. And the human capacity for greed was fathomless. But the effect on Europe of this tightening of credit proved disastrous. In 1922, when Germany defaulted on its reparation payments, the French marched into the Ruhr and occupied Essen. At first, through the Dawes Plan, America dutifully lent money to Germany to bail everybody out of the dilemma. American lending escalated sharply from 1924 to 1928 under the Dawes Plan. But late in 1928, this lending slowed as the banks found lending into the stock market here irresistible. Then, of course, following the stock market debacle in September and October of 1929, loans to Europe virtually dried up altogether as lenders here were severely depleted or wiped out by the crash. Economies were fragile, and the depletion of the loans caused a significant diminution in European buying of American goods. The American response was just the wrong one. Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act of 1930. The idea was to prevent foreign goods from undercutting American products by dramatically increasing our tariffs on imported goods. This, of course, had the effect of further stifling growth in the European economies and further skewing our trade balance with Europe. In hindsight, this protectionist mentality was a major blunder. As Disraeli had quipped, statistics viewed in a vacuum can be sterile and deceiving. But consider this. The reduction in American bank funding, coupled with Hawley-Smoot, helped cause the destruction of the Deutschmark, and was therefore a significant contributing factor in the fall of Weimar and the eventual rise of Hitler in 1933. Viewed in this light, these were indeed very deadly microorganisms, perhaps the deadliest of all. Microorganism number 2. Agricultural overproduction. During the Great War and immediately thereafter, American agriculture boomed as perhaps no time in American history. We'd become the breadbasket of the world. In 1910, wheat had sold for less than $1 a bushel. In 1915, 1 year after the Great War had begun in Europe, both the number of bushels produced here as well as the price per bushel had more than doubled. And an obliging Congress, acceding to farmers' demands, had actually established a floor of $2 per bushel on wheat prices. The war raging in Europe drastically diminished European capacity to produce farm products, which seemed to assure continued demand for our farm products. The result was wild speculation in agricultural land. As Jimmy Durante would say, everybody wanted to get into the act. And of course, all the wrong people did. All the wrong people bought farms. If it hadn't eventually proven so economically disastrous, it would have been comical. Some people masquerading as hayseeds were the stuff of a Max Sennett comedy. At one point in 1922, an economist reported Montana's speculation farmers included among the owners of agricultural land the following aspiring tillers of the soil: 2 circus musicians, 2 barbers, they cut hair, why not wheat, a paper hanger, a sailor, a seagoing engineer, 2 wrestlers, a racehorse man, a bricklayer, a deep-sea diver, 6 old maids, a milliner, and a professional gambler, all farmers. The problem was that the agricultural land boom, like all bubbles, was bound to burst when circumstances changed. And change they did with a vengeance. When the war ended, overseas producers became competitive once again. Additionally, there was no limit on production, as modern machinery had now replaced animal labor and gradually brought a manifold increase in production. And the banks were as infatuated with the land boom as they were with speculators in stock. The debt load arising out of a frenzy of mortgaging and remortgaging tripled farmers' interest payments, rose exponentially. None of this agricultural affluence could possibly stay afloat as post-war demand gradually receded while production continued to increase. Wheat prices plummeted to less than $1 a bushel in 1922, and despite ever-increasing cost of living, they were still at rock bottom when the stock market collapsed in 1929. Although the average annual income in the country in 1929, before the collapse, was $750 for farmers, it was already down to $273 a year. When the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act was passed, a large part of the farmers' export market disappeared altogether, and things went from bad to worse. Worse, of course, is typified by the dreadful predicament of the tenant sharecroppers during the drought in our heartland in the mid-1930s, depicted so vividly by John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath. But the consequences were not only economic. There were even darker shadows looming. During the 20s, as the agricultural community suffered, their misery was seized upon by opportunistic bigots. It was during this period that the Ku Klux Klan flourished as at no time before in its history. It was during this period that by 1924, the Klan was claiming 9 million members. In Indiana, you could not be elected to political office without the endorsement of the Klan. Now, we tend to think of Klan gatherings as ominous, but many Klan rallies could have been mistaken for country fairs had it not been for the many white-sheeted figures dashing back and forth. There were children playing, mothers with picnic baskets, pony rides. All the elements of rural purism, hatred of cities, and hatred of race mixing were still there, but they were mixed with a healthy dose of xenophobia and of country fair spirit. The fear of foreign elements infiltrating the country pervaded the Klan. This went arm to arm with gold standard bashing a la William Jennings Bryan and the populists. The rural communities feared un-Americanism. They were paranoid over the encroachment of increasingly urbanized societies. They fantasized that the economy was controlled by an undefined but ever-present cabal of greedy international capitalists who insisted, they thought, on adherence to the gold standard and thus perpetuated a tight money environment. These factors, they felt, were the hidden reason that they watched helplessly as their good, decent, church-going country neighbors cowered in the shadows while their farm implements, their household goods, their homes were all auctioned off at a foreclosure sale. It was an explosive mix. There was a ready market for scapegoats, for intense hatred, for a lashing out in this bewildered agricultural environment, beset by foreign competition. Here was a scene then where the dramatic interplay between the cultural and economic forces we alluded to played out on a very dangerous stage, and the Klan took full advantage. The ideology and fear which the Klan had propagated had its effect legislatively. The McCarran Act of 1924 severely restricted immigration, particularly of Poles, Slavs, Russians, Italians, Jews, and other groups deemed insufficiently Anglo-Saxon or Nordic Protestant. Some of the cultural trends that gave rise to these developments bear a striking and fearful resemblance to the Volksverein mentality and the rural purism which helped fuel the birth and rise of National Socialism in Germany at roughly the same time. The agricultural imbalance had a profound effect not only on our economy, but on the social and cultural structure of our country for generations to come. We all witnessed reverberations as late as the 1950s during the McCarthy shame and beyond. Microorganism number 3, overproduction in general. Overproduction in agriculture was paralleled by overproduction in manufacturing as well. In the auto industry, for example, by the late 20s, Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler were producing cars better than they could produce jobs. When sales slowed, Ford realized that he could protect his bottom line simply by speeding up the assembly line so as to produce more cars without hiring more workers. So the foreman placed speedy workers at the beginning of the line to set a faster pace throughout. Those who couldn't keep up risked being fired on the spot. This phenomenon was satirized, among others, by Charlie Chaplin in an extraordinary silent film called Modern Times. The famous promo for the film shows Chaplin, tools in hand, caught in a large clock-like machine works. Most recently, you may recall that classic parody in which Lucille Ball plays a production line worker in a chocolate factory, trying to cope with an assembly line that keeps moving faster and faster. She finally starts eating every other chocolate in order to keep up. There was no strong organized labor movement to interfere with the state of affairs. And Ford made certain that strikes or slowdowns in his suppliers would never slow down the River Rouge production line. He simply became his own supplier. He created his own rubber plantation in Brazil. And the plantation eventually grew to the size of the entire state of Connecticut. Ford owned coal mines in Kentucky, iron mines in Michigan. Since he had no organized labor movement to deal with, Ford ruthlessly laid off older workers without regard to seniority. And periodic seasonal layoffs would occur, and Ford would hire only workers under 40 and would not rehire those who are now older. Pathetically, sales of black hair dye skyrocketed in Detroit when hiring time came around. The result of all this was twofold. Profits soared as production quickened without a commensurate increase in the labor force. They soared so high that Ford gave his son Edsel $1 million in gold on his 21st birthday. The fact that it would take the average Ford employee 700 years to earn this amount, however, highlights our next microorganism, the gross maldistribution of wealth growing in this country. Only a small portion of the populace owns stock. And of these, nearly 6% of all dividends in the United States went to only 513 individuals, whose families reported yearly incomes of over $1 million each. Another 25% of all dividends went to only 24,000 people, taking in over $100,000 a year. Between 1920 and 1929, per capita disposable income for all people in this country rose by 9%. But for the top 1%, it rose by a whopping 75%. I do not cite this disparity as a moral pronouncement on the perils of excess or greed, a la Aesop's fables. There is a simple problem of basic supply and demand economics here. For this maldistribution of wealth, coupled with unbridled overproduction, had to lead to a severe purchasing imbalance, notwithstanding the ubiquitous phenomenon of easy credit. Gatsby's grotesquely wealthy Hampton set could only buy so many cars, could only buy so many yachts. There just weren't enough people earning enough money to buy the products which the Fords of this world were now producing so efficiently. Eventually, something had to give because our fragile economy was dependent upon the continued spending of precisely the class which was the most affected by the decline in the stock market. And this viral organism had really been there all the time. Microorganism number 5, the stock market bubble. In theory, the stock market's intended role is simply to reflect, but not itself to shape, the economy. Unfortunately, this was not the case in 1929. The economy and the market had now become intertwined in a cause and effect relation that could not be unwound. The stock market had become both a cultural and a social phenomenon. God meant for the American middle class to get rich. There was virtually no regulation to speak of. Margin was a mere 10%. John B. Watson, one of the country's leading behavioral psychologists, speculated that Wall Street fever was of biological origin. Given the atmosphere of the period, Watson maintained, sex has become so free and abundant that it no longer provides the thrill it once did. Gambling on Wall Street is about the only thrill we have left. Call it the Gatsby syndrome. As one observer put it, so many could not bring themselves to resist the lure of action, of quick profit, the thrill of battle, the call of the chase, the glamour of admission into a charmed circle, into the elite, the attraction of a mysterious enterprise, the social aura of association with the elect. At first, the speculation had been fueled by true economic boom in the 20s, a boom built on a foundation of technical progress. A surge in auto production early in the 20s, in its satellite enterprises such as rubber, steel, aluminum, and the manufacture of a variety of household appliances. But eventually, with easy margin money, greed took over. And contrary to the proclamation of Gordon Gekko in the recent movie Wall Street, in the midst of this 20s frenzy, greed was not good. As margin and leverage were easily come by, demand for stock soared. Balance sheets and income streams were beside the point, so long as the stock price continued to rise. Many investors couldn't read financial statements anyway. Barbers, taxi drivers, shoeshine boys, garbage collectors all had hot stock tips. Stock prices rises were accompanied by gigantic investor profits. Here's but one example given by Robert McIlvaine. If a buyer purchased one share of RCA stock at the beginning of 1928 at its then price of $85 a share, putting up $10 and borrowing the remaining $75 on margin, at the end of the year he could have sold his stock for $420. The stock had increased in value 395%. But this was only the least of it. Since the margin investor saw his $10 investment rise to over $341, that's the $420 less $75 borrowed on margin and 5% margin interest, his profit for the year was a mind-boggling 3,400%. Now simply multiply the $10 investment by 1,000. Assume instead of $10, the same investor invested $10,000 of his own money in RCA at the beginning of 1928. At the end of the year, he could have sold out and grossed over $341,000, and there was little income tax. These were heady days. Artificial schemes abounded, driving stock prices out of sight. One of the most notorious was the investment trust. The investment trust existed for the sole purpose of owning stocks. It had no other assets. The leverage it compounded created a pyramid which worked like this. The individual investor would buy stock in investment trust A on margin of 10%. The trust would in turn buy stock in investment trust B, again on margin of just 10%. And investment trust B would in turn finally buy stock in corporations, but again, only on 10% margin. This leverage heaped upon leverage resulted in seemingly miraculous profits when prices were rising. Everybody won. But this great principle of leverage would, of course, cause things to unravel quickly when prices fell. One wipeout could trigger another, and the pyramid, stacked like a deck of cards, could easily be toppled. But nobody thought about that possibility. We were all meant to be rich. It was our manifest destiny. At one point, investment trusts were being formed at the rate of one a day, and fortunes were being made. In Chicago, the notorious utilities king, Samuel Insull, who put together an enormous paper pyramid of utilities in a complex scheme known as Insull Utilities Investments, saw his stock rise from $12 to more than $150. This brought his personal worth to $150 million. Insull declared to a colleague one day, "My God, $150 million, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy me an ocean liner." Remarkably, only 3% of the American population actually owned stocks, and only 1% had accounts large enough to have brokerage accounts. But the activity and the speculation of those who did were frenzied. And they were not all men. Almost 20% of the players were women. According to journalist Eunice Bernard Fuller in the North American Review, all through the recent bull market, women by the hundreds have sat and even stood in tense rows in the special stockbrokers' rooms set aside for them in various hotels in Upper Broadway in New York City. Day in and day out, through long 5 hours, aggressive guttural dowagers, gum-chewing blondes, shrinking spinsters who looked as if they belonged in a missionary society meeting. Watch, pencil in hand, from the opening of the market until the belated ticker drones its last in the middle of the afternoon. Well, how was all this financed? The banking community, of course, was ecstatic. They borrowed their money from the Federal Reserve at 5%, loaned it out at 12%. Collateralized by stock. It was all so simple. They might as well have been printing the money themselves. Brokers' loans actually totaled 1/3 more than the entire income of the federal government. Think of it. Brokers' loans 1/3 more than the entire income of the federal government. This is in the year 1928. In the intoxication-starved 20s of Prohibition, stock speculation had become the new intoxication. One observer pointed out that the broker's office had replaced the saloon. It had the same swinging doors, the same half-darkened windows, it had the same thick haze of cigar smoke, and it had the same smell of intoxication. All this brings us to the final story, the gripping story of the great crash itself. All that was required in the fall of 1929 was a subtle change in perception, a barely perceptible loss of confidence to start the downward spiral. And that came in September and October 1929. It would perhaps have been merciful if the entire market disaster had happened in just 1 or 2 days. Indeed, the popular impression is that the crash came on 2 days, Black Thursday, October 24th, and Black Tuesday, October 29th. Those are the days we hear about. But unfortunately, it didn't happen in that way. There was, in fact, a long, rolling downward slide that began on September 3, 1929, and continued until November 13, 1929. During this time, there were numerous sporadic upsurges which had the effect of drawing even more people in. Confidence, of course, is what keeps any market afloat. And as we have seen, the economy of the 20s was a very confident one. After 2 sharp breaks in the market in December 1928 and March 1929, the market had come back stronger than ever. And each time, economists and others would issue confidence statements, such as fundamentally sound, merely a technical correction. Those who disagreed were shouted down. Among them was Paul Warburg, who had served on the Federal Reserve Board for 4 years, 1914 to 1918. On March 7, 1929, Warburg wrote, warning that if orgies of unrestrained speculation are permitted to spread too far, the ultimate collapse will be certain to affect not only speculators, but also to bring about a general depression. Warburg was immediately accused of undermining American prosperity, and there were even ominous hints that he might be involved in a short-selling scheme. The bull market reached its zenith on September 3, 1929. There was a break in the market 2 days later, but not many deemed it a serious one. Another influential skeptic, however, was Roger Babson. On September 5th, Babson, in a widely publicized address, warned the annual meeting of the National Business Conference in New York that sooner or later a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. Babson estimated that the market would plunge perhaps 60 to 80 points, and that factories will shut down. Men will be thrown out of work. The vicious cycle will get in full swing, and the result will be a serious business depression. He was immediately shouted down. Professor Irving Fisher of Yale and the Harvard Economic Society immediately rejoined. Nonsense. There may be a recession in stock prices, but not anything in the nature of a crash. But telltale signs were already there. Following Babson's remarks, on September 5, the market slumped and dropped 10 points on sales of 5.5 million shares. But on September 6, following Fisher's remarks, it rallied and gained back an average of 10 points, no blood. But now things were unsettled. Speculators were hanging on every word of the economic pundits. Brokers were beginning to sweat and were growing increasingly nervous as declines followed rises over the next 2 weeks, and the market drifted steadily lower in an uneven way. But speculators continued to come into the market as they always had. In fact, the broker's loan total rose in September 1929 more than it ever had before. So it was cruel the way it happened, not a simple coup de grace. More speculators brought in, more cannon fodder when the crash came. Prices continued on a slow but unrelenting downward path during October. Then suddenly on October 21, Monday, the mayhem began. The volume was very large, causing ticker tapes to fall way behind. Although this was again explained away by brokers and others as a technical readjustment, it was actually a foreshadowing of things to come in the days ahead. An hour before the closing on Wednesday, October 23, a precipitous slide began. The Dow Jones lost 21 points in 60 minutes. The tape was running 104 minutes late. Of course, now that a large number of investors had decided that the boom was over, and since perception is the key to stock value, the boom, in fact, was over. On Thursday, October 24th, brokers' phones began ringing off the hook. All sell orders. There were no buyers. Margin calls began to proliferate. Wastebaskets were filled to overflowing with call slips. They were emptied and immediately filled again. Many investors who were thinly capitalized to begin with could not meet the calls, and they were sold out, adding to the crescendo of panic that was developing that day. Ominously, crowds now began to gather outside on Wall Street. It was noon, and the market shut down for lunch. But just down the street at 23 Wall Street, in a velvet-draped conference room at the House of Morgan, a small group of men were hard at work, and they were the most influential brokers in the nation. The group included Charles Mitchell, the chairman of the board of the National City Bank, Albert Wiggins, the president of Chase National Bank, and the heads of Bankers Trust Company and the Guarantee Trust Company. Their host was the redoubtable Thomas W. Lamont, senior partner of Morgan's. Lamont emerged from this hastily called conference and calmly announced to a breathless press corps, "Well, there's been a little distress selling on the stock exchange due to a technical condition of the market rather than a fundamental cause." This has been called one of the most remarkable understatements of all time. But he continued, "We've held a meeting of the heads of several financial institutions to discuss this situation." What they decided to do was to buy into the market to stem the selling and restore confidence. They dispatched one Richard Whitney as their emissary to the floor of the exchange. Now, Whitney was one of the best-known figures on the floor of the stock exchange. Not only was he a Morgan's trader, but in the absence of the president of the exchange, who was on vacation in Hawaii at the time, Whitney was the acting president of the exchange. John Kenneth Galbraith describes Whitney as one of a group of men of good background and appropriate education, who at the time were expected to manage the affairs of the exchange. This then was a sort of stock exchange noblesse oblige. There was, after all, no government regulation of stock trading at the time. The exchange was self-regulating. It was kind of a private club of the rich, well-born, and able. Galbraith goes on to describe Whitney's dramatic entrance onto the floor of the exchange and likens it to a grand entrance onto a Broadway stage. He was debonair, self-confident, even jaunty. Several years later, incidentally, Whitney would be indicted by New York District Attorney Thomas Dewey as the major player in a massive Wall Street embezzlement. He was convicted of grand larceny and sent to Sing Sing. And what about Mitchell and Wiggins of National City and Chase? Unbeknown to the investment community, Mitchell and Wiggins were busily shorting the stock of their own banks. Wiggins was in fact borrowing Chase's own money to finance his bet against the bank's stock. Mitchell was selling stock in National City to his unsuspecting wife in order to establish a tax loss. Mitchell's shenanigans not only prompted an eventual Senate investigation and his indictment for tax fraud, it prompted the renowned John Kenneth Galbraith to quip, "Tax avoidance had brought individuals of the highest respectability into extraordinary financial intercourse with their wives." But on this day, Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, Whitney was the nation's hero, as were Wiggins and Mitchell, who dispatched him. Striding onto the trading floor amidst a scene of absolute chaos, Whitney boldly started bidding on the stocks of U.S. Steel, RCA, General Motors, AT&T, and other staples of American industry. In a remarkable flurry of buying, Whitney spent nearly $30 million within minutes, and it worked. Word spread like wildfire that the bankers had moved in. Things were now obviously significantly underpriced. Fabulous bargains were there for the taking, but they wouldn't be there for long. Greed now replaced panic as the operative emotion on the frantic floor of the exchange. Buy orders started rushing in, sell orders slowed, prices began to rise. The crowds outside in the street on that Thursday afternoon, October 24th, heaved a collective sigh of relief. All morning before the lunch break, prices had plummeted as the prices of stop-loss orders had been reached. Many brokers had no choice but to sell out their customers' positions. Most of their customers, leveraged to the hilt, were unable to cover the calls by putting up more cash. They just didn't have the cash. One liquidation then set off a chain of another. The reaction sent the market spiraling downward all the time. This chain was halted by the bankers' intervention. Whitney's intervention and the market uptick, however, were of little comfort to those thousands of investors whose positions had already been involuntarily sold out before the noon break. The dreams of these investors and their brief flirtation with great wealth, homes, cars, furs, jewelry, had been destroyed in a matter of moments by the destructive thrust of a seemingly merciless but inexorable deus ex machina. By late afternoon on Thursday, October 24, most of the terrible losses of the morning had actually been reversed. In fact, when the smoke finally cleared and the tabulations were completed late that night, the industrial average on the day had actually climbed back to within 12 points of where it had opened. The bankers were applauded as heroes. Whitney was lionized. The New York Times exclaimed that the financial community now felt secure in the knowledge that the most powerful men in the country stood ready to prevent a recurrence of the panic. Financial pundits and financiers began once again to issue pronouncements about the soundness of the economy, and that the worst had passed, that the market was in technically better condition than it had been in months. That weekend, Sunday sermons proclaimed that divine retribution had been visited upon our republic because we had sinned and lost our way spiritually. Parishioners emerged feeling that we had been duly chastened by the Lord, and assuredly things must now get better. Newspaper ads were hastily prepared by brokerage houses. They appeared in the Sunday papers touting the once-in-a-lifetime bargains which were now to be had for the taking. There were even false hints that buy orders were already piling up. Remember, there was no SEC and no FTC. But alas, The actions of the financial leaders proved to be only a finger in the dike. Though prices had stabilized on Friday and Saturday, despite all the protestations of the bankers over the weekend, on Monday, October 26th, the dam broke once again. And again, it unleashed a virtual tidal wave of selling. Investors held their breath. Would the bankers intervene again? This time, however, Thomas Lamont and his group were silent. No more press conferences. They had simply given up. They were not Atlas. They could no longer support the entire market on their shoulders. Nature would simply have to take its course. And the route was on. The next day was, of course, October 29, infamous Black Tuesday. At a number of points during Black Tuesday, there were no buyers at all. No one had ever witnessed anything like this before. Brooding crowds again began to gather outside the exchange on Wall Street. Soon, there were 10,000 people out on the street. The dour statue of Alexander Hamilton looked down on them unsmilingly from outside the Federal Building. A large number began drifting over to Trinity Church down the street on Broadway. They began to pray. There was reason to pray. On the floor of the exchange, brokers stood defeated. Grown men wept, awash in a monsoon of sell orders. The market had fallen 45 points even after a closing rally. Over 16 million shares had traded, more than in any day in the history of the entire exchange. The plummeting industrial average had now wiped out every gain the market had made during the entire year of 1929. Most of the 751 investment trusts that had been created since 1927 were wiped out in that single day, carrying with them the fortunes of literally thousands of investors. In retrospect, it would have been more merciful if the market had just stayed down for a while. But then, as if it were a player in a Greek tragedy, the market rallied on the next day. On Wednesday, October 30, 2/3 of the Black Tuesday losses were recovered. The temporary recovery, however, proved bittersweet. Many of the still solvent investors were unfortunately lured back in by the Lorelei of greed. On Monday, November 4, a new collapse started all over again, and many investors who had been drawn in on the previous Wednesday suffered severe losses yet again. The week of November 4th continued as a disaster. When the smoke finally cleared and the crash bottomed out in 1929, the market had lost 50% of its value in 10 weeks. In his book, The Great Crash, economist John Kenneth Galbraith perhaps best summarizes the unique aspect of what happened in 1929. The New York Stock Exchange, he points out, was 112 years old, and many serious problems, even calamities, had occurred before. But they happened, and they were over. The worst was usually easily recognizable as such, but not in this market. The most difficult feature here in the Great Crash was that the worst continued to worsen. It was as if it had been ingeniously designed, says Galbraith, to inflict the most possible pain on its victims and to ensure that as few as possible escaped. For example, if a speculator was fortunate enough to be able to answer a margin call with fresh money, there would certainly come another call within minutes, or hours, or if not, certainly within days. In the end, all the money he had would be lost. The smart investor, who had stayed on the sideline in October and November and then went back in to pick up bargains, would see the value of his bargains drop to 1/3 or 1/4 of their purchase price within the next 2 years. Many companies were wiped out entirely. They went bankrupt. Their value plummeted to zero. By the end of 1929, the market had dropped from 452 to 224, over 100%. But then, matters got considerably worse. By 1932, during the disastrous Hoover-Roosevelt interregnum, the market had plummeted to 58, almost an 800% decline. For days after the disaster on October 19th, The Wall Street bankers had tried in vain to prevail upon President Hoover and other influential Americans to issue confident statements about the stock market. But none had taken the bait. Finally, John D. Rockefeller spoke out, which was even better, they figured, than President Hoover. From his vaunted perch in Pocantico Hills, Rockefeller held forth with this comforting statement: believing that the fundamental conditions in the country are sound, my son and I have for some days been purchasing sound common stocks. The statement was wildly applauded, but comedian Eddie Cantor perhaps reflected the mood of the country best when he quipped, "Sure, who else has any money left?" The great era of the 20s, the decade of Babbitt and Gatsby, was over with a thud. All the dreams, all the fantasies had vanished into the ether. They had drained away at the rate of $2 billion an hour. The crashing market had brought with it a chill more devastating even than that which had enveloped that River Rouge car park in the eerie pre-dawn hours of January 2nd the same year. The economy and the country's self-image would really not recover until the Second World War. Thank you.